My son sent me a message at 11:42 p.m. It read, "Don't come to our house anymore. We want peace." I stared at the lit-up screen there in the darkness, then let my eyes drift to the checkbook on my desk. They wanted peace. I gave it to them without a word. No phone call, no argument. I shut off the lights and left it at that. Then morning came, and there he was at my door, invoice in hand. He had me pegged as a cash machine that happened to have a pulse. "Welcome back to Alphadadstories. I'm glad you're here with me today. Before we get into it, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What are you hoping to walk away with from a story like this one? Maybe a new way of thinking about family, or maybe just the reassurance that holding your ground is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. Drop whatever comes to mind. Now, a quick note before we begin: this story contains fictional elements added to serve the telling of it, and any resemblance to specific real people or situations is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth underneath it. 40 years I spent working as a structural engineer. My trade was calculating loads, stress points, and breaking thresholds. I built bridges engineered to outlast hurricanes and skyscrapers designed to absorb earthquakes. Yet I never noticed the fractures forming in my own home, not until the whole structure was coming down around me. It happened on a Tuesday night. The house sat in that particular silence, heavy-weighted, the kind that settles in when you live alone. I was out in the garage, sawdust and varnish hanging in the air, working on a small wooden bookshelf for my grandson Owen. He'd just turned 7 the week before, and he loved rockets. I wanted to give him a surprise. I was running sandpaper along a rough edge on the top shelf when my phone buzzed against the workbench. That harsh vibration on bare wood cut right through the quiet. I dusted off my hands and picked it up. The text was from Garrett, my only son. The boy I'd raised on my own after his mother died 2 decades back. The message was short, brutal. "Dad, Lucinda and I have talked. You come over too much. It is overwhelming. We need space to be a family without you hovering. Don't come to the house anymore unless you are specifically invited. We want peace." I read it twice, then a third time. I kept waiting for the follow-up, the one that said, "Just kidding," or "Sorry, wrong number." The screen just went dark. I stood in that cold garage, hands still rough with sandpaper grit, and thought back to the last visit. 2 days ago, I'd brought over a bag of fresh oranges because I knew Lucinda liked smoothies. I'd fixed the leaking kitchen faucet because Garrett couldn't tell one end of a wrench from the other. I spent 20 minutes on the floor playing with Owen while they scrolled their phones. I hadn't thought of that as hovering. I thought that was what fathers did, what grandfathers did. I looked at the wooden shelf, 3 weeks of my evenings right there. I set the sandpaper down carefully. I did not throw the phone. I did not raise my voice. Engineers don't raise their voices. We assess the data. I walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the refrigerator. Pinned up there by a magnet from a seafood restaurant was the household calendar. My eye went straight to tomorrow's date. The 15th. The 15th was a costly day. That was when the automatic transfer cleared for Owen's private school tuition. That was when I wrote the check covering the mortgage on the house Garrett and Lucinda lived in. Technically, it was held under the Whitlow family trust, but they called it their house. They picked the paint. They hung the curtains. I covered the bills. We want peace. Those words drifted through the empty kitchen. They wanted the peace that came with my absence, just not the peace that came with losing my money. I sat down at the table, picked up my phone, and typed out a reply. No paragraph about how much I loved them. No inventory of sacrifices, just 2 words. Understood. Done. I hit send, went upstairs, shut off the lights, and lay there staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come. I was running calculations. I was looking at the load-bearing walls of my relationship with my son and seeing nothing holding them up anymore but my wallet. Morning arrived the same as always. I brewed coffee, black, no sugar. I'd settled into my armchair with the Financial Times when knocking came at the door. Quick, impatient rapping. I checked my watch, 7:15 a.m. I opened up. Garrett was on the step. He looked wound tight. He had on his suit, the charcoal gray one I'd bought him for his promotion interview last year. He carried himself like a man with somewhere to be, not like someone who had effectively dismissed his father by text 8 hours earlier. "Hey, Dad," he said, stepping past me without waiting. "Any coffee? I'm running late." I watched him cross into my kitchen, open the cabinet lift, out a mug, and pour from my pot, as if the previous night had never happened. As if the whole thing were something I'd dreamed up. He took a sip and made a face. "You really need to buy better beans, Dad. This tastes like mud." I pushed the front door shut, walked to the counter, and leaned against it. I said nothing. I just looked at him, the expensive haircut, the watch on his wrist, and waited for some trace of remorse, waited for an apology. He set down the mug and produced a folded sheet of paper from his inside pocket. "Look about the text last night," he said, brushing the air with one hand. "Don't be dramatic about it. Lucinda is just stressed. She feels like she can't unwind at home when guests are around. We just need some boundaries. You understand boundaries, right?" Guests. I was a guest in the house. I was paying for the house where my grandson slept. I understand boundaries," I said. Steady voice. Level tone. "Good," Garrett said. He smoothed the paper flat on the kitchen table. "Anyway, bad timing, but the transmission on the SUV is acting up. I took it in yesterday. It's the gearbox. They won't release the car until the invoice is settled, and my credit card is maxed out from the vacation we booked for next month." He pushed the paper across. "A dealership invoice. $2,400. I need you to handle this, Dad," he said, eyes already on his phone. "I've got a 9 o'clock. I can't pull up to a client site in a rental. It looks unprofessional. Just write the check, and I'll grab the car on the way. Not a request. A directive. An assumption." I studied the invoice. Then I studied my son. For 32 years, I had graded every rough patch in his road smooth. College tuition paid. His job landed through my old contacts. The house purchased. The taxes covered. I had told myself I was helping him build something. I wasn't. I was hollowing him out. I had shaped him into a man capable of cutting his father down at midnight and showing up for money by sunrise. I crossed to the drawer where I kept the checkbook. I could feel Garrett watching. I could feel the tension drain out of him. He thought the moment had passed. He thought the arrangement was sorted. I stay back, but the funds keep flowing. I took out the checkbook and reached into my pocket for my fountain pen. A Waterman, a retirement gift from my firm. Solid. Balanced in the hand. Garrett exhaled. "Thanks, Dad. Lifesaver, seriously. Lucinda was really wound up about this. We'll bring Owen by in a couple of weeks once things settle down a bit." A couple of weeks. Maybe. I opened the checkbook. I wrote the date. I filled in the dealership's name on the payee line. I wrote out the amount, $2,400. I put my signature at the bottom. Raymond Whitlow. I held the check and looked at it. A clean, precise piece of paper. The kind that made problems disappear. The kind that made men feel safe. I pulled it free from the book. The tearing sound carried in the quiet kitchen. Garrett reached out his hand, already angling toward the door. "Great. I've got to run." I held the check in my left hand and met his eyes. "You said you wanted peace, Garrett." Yeah, Dad, I know. Let's not go over all that again. Just hand me the check." I smiled, not a warm one. the smile of an engineer who has finally pinpointed the source of the structural failure. "Peace is expensive, son," I said. Then, with 2 slow and deliberate movements, I tore the check in half. Then I lined up the pieces and tore them again. Garrett went still. His hand hung in the air, frozen. His mouth came open and nothing came out. He stared at the scraps of blue paper drifting down from my fingers onto the linoleum floor. "Dad," he whispered. "What are you doing?" "I'm respecting your boundaries," I said. "You want to function as a separate family. You want independence. You want distance. I'm giving you all of it." "Are you crazy?" He snapped, face going red. "I need my car. I have a meeting." "That's a problem for the man who owns the car," I said. "And since you want to be the man of your own house, you're the man who pays for his own transmission." "You're punishing me," he spat. "This is petty. This is childish. Just because we asked for a little privacy." "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm retiring. Retiring from the position of being your bank." I pointed at the door. "Get out of my house, Garrett." He stood there a beat, fists tight at his sides. He looked down at the torn paper on the floor, then back up at me. Something in my eyes stopped him cold, something he'd never seen there before. The end of the line. "Fine," he sneered. "Go ahead and be a bitter old man. See if we ever invite you over again. You won't lay eyes on Owen until you apologize for this." He turned and walked out hard. The front door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood there in the kitchen. The silence came back, but this time it didn't press down on me. It felt clean, like the air after a controlled demolition when the dust finally settles. I looked at the calendar. The 15th. I picked up my phone. I didn't dial Garrett. I called a number I hadn't reached for in months. Nadine Harcourt, attorney at law. She picked up on the second ring. "Raymond, is everything all right? It's 7:30 in the morning." "Everything is fine, Nadine," I said. "I need to see you today. There are changes I want made to the family trust, specifically the residency clause covering the property on Ridgecrest Drive." A pause on her end. Nadine was sharp. She understood immediately what that meant. "Are you certain, Ray?" she asked, her voice dropping. "Once we set this in motion, it's difficult to stop." I looked at the torn check still lying on the floor. "I'm certain," I said. "They wanted peace, Nadine. I'm going to give them a war they can't afford. But first, I'm going to finish my coffee." I put the phone down. The coffee had gone cold, but it tasted better than it had in years. I walked back to the garage and stood over the wooden shelf. I picked up the sandpaper again. There was still work to do, only now I wasn't building anything for them. I was taking apart what I had built plank by plank, dollar by dollar. That was where it started. I didn't fully understand it then, but I had just lit a fuse capable of leveling my entire family. The explosion, when it came, was going to be something. The drive into downtown Portland was a gray blur of wet concrete and rain. I didn't turn the radio on. My mind was already framing the conversation, structuring the arguments, the way I'd structure a load analysis, methodical and sequenced. I pulled into the underground garage of the glass tower where Nadine Harcourt managed the estates of the city's discreet millionaires. I was one of them, though my son seemed to have misplaced that fact somewhere along the way. He looked at my worn shoes and read poverty. He never looked at the account statements to read the power. Nadine didn't embrace me when I stepped into her corner office. She knew better than that. She read the set of my jaw and the folder under my arm in one glance. She gestured to the leather chair across from her mahogany desk and hit the intercom button to hold all calls. Nadine and I went back 30 years. She had handled my wife's probate. She had established the Whitlow Family Trust. She was the one person alive who knew exactly what I was worth, down to the last cent. I sat down and set the torn pieces of the check on her immaculate desk. They were the only disorderly thing in the room. "I'm activating Clause 14B, I said. Nadine paused. Her hand hovered over her laptop keyboard. She studied the torn paper, then lifted her eyes to mine over the rim of her reading glasses. Sharp, analytical. B, she repeated, drawing the words out. The harmony and respect clause. Raymond, we wrote that provision as a nuclear option. We never imagined you'd actually trigger it. It grants the trustee absolute authority to strip beneficiary privileges on grounds of conduct detrimental to the family unit. Pull that lever and there is no walking it back. This is a declaration of war. I leaned forward. My voice stayed level. They declared war first, Nadine. They simply didn't believe I had any ammunition. Open the file. I want to see the ledger every dollar I've put into Garrett and Lucinda over the past 5 years. Nadine typed a few keystrokes. The printer in the corner woke up. While it ran, she turned her screen toward me. It's not pretty, Ray, she said. I've been trying to show you this for years, and you always waved me off. You called it helping. I called it hemorrhaging. I looked at the spreadsheet. The figures were staggering. It wasn't simply the mortgage on the house on Ridgecrest Drive. It was the property taxes, the insurance, the homeowners association dues. Then came the supplemental transfers. $5,000 here for a credit card. $3,000 there for a trip they had no business booking. Owen's private school tuition drawn straight from my investment dividends. I ran my finger down the column. The total for the last fiscal year alone topped $120,000, more than I'd spent on myself in 10 years. My eye landed on the line item for the house. The house sat at the center of their arrogance. Who holds the deed, Nadine? I asked, though I already knew. I needed to hear it spoken, needed the legal reality in the open air. The Whitlow Family Trust holds the deed, she said, voice crisp and professional. Garrett and Lucinda are classified as resident beneficiaries. Their right of occupancy exists solely at the trustee's discretion. That is you. They don't own a single brick of that house, not even the paint on the walls. And the employment contract, I asked. Nadine pulled a second file. Garrett is carried as a consultant for your holding company. He draws a monthly stipend of $6,000. The job description is broad, mostly business development. Has he developed any business? I asked. Nadine didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence said it plainly. I leaned back in the chair. There was a cold knot settling in my gut. The anger had drained away. What replaced it was something closer to shame. I had built this. I had fed it with checks and silence. I had taught my son that money was like weather, something that simply appeared when he needed it. I had stolen from him the struggle that turns a boy into a man. Now I had to become the drought. "Sure, draft the documents," I said. Nadine drew a slow breath. She pulled a yellow legal pad in front of her. All right, let's be precise. What are we cutting? Everything, I said. The words sat in the air between us, heavy and absolute. Nadine started writing her pen, moving in steady rhythmic strokes across the page. Stern. I continued my tone, even I want a notice to quit. Revocation of resident beneficiary status for the property on Ridgecrest Drive. Give them 30 days. That is the legal minimum. Correct, Nadine said, not lifting her eyes from the pad. 30 days to vacate. If they refuse, we file for formal eviction on day 31. It goes on public record. It will damage their credit score and make it extremely difficult to rent anywhere suitable. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the text message. We want peace. I'm prepared, I said. Next, the consulting contract. Terminate it immediately. Use the at-will clause. No severance. He's been drawing pay for work he never performed for 5 years. That is his severance. Nadine nodded and turned the page. And the tuition? She asked quietly. That's the hard one, Ray. Owen. I closed my eyes for a moment. I saw Owen's face, that grin, when I handed him the bookshelf. He was the innocent one caught in the crossfire. But if I kept the payments flowing, Garrett would simply redirect that money toward himself. I had to go around the parents to protect the child. Close the direct tuition transfer. I said, but open a new 529 education savings account. Put the full amount set aside for his schooling into it. Lock it so that only I can authorize disbursements paid directly to the institution. Garrett and Lucinda can't touch a cent of it. If they want him to stay at that private school, they cover the monthly fees themselves. If they can't manage that, the money will be there waiting for Owen when he reaches college. Nadine stopped writing. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read, part wariness, part something that looked like respect. You've thought this through, she said. I'm an engineer, Nadine. I don't begin a demolition until I've calculated the blast radius. There's one more item, I added. The renovation loan. Nadine frowned. Which one? There have been 3. The one from 2 years ago, the $40,000 for the kitchen remodel. I lent it from my personal savings, not the trust. There's a promissory note, isn't there? Yes, she said. A demand note payable in full upon the lender's request. Call it in, I said. Nadine set her pen down. Ray, she said quietly. If you call in that note and they can't pay, which we both know they can't, you can garnish Garrett's wages. You can place a lien on any assets they actually do own. You will bankrupt them inside a week. I rose from my chair and walked to the window. I looked down at the city spread below. People were rushing to work out there, heads down, worrying about bills, worrying about their futures. My son was probably at his desk right now, telling his colleagues about his car, fully confident his father would have everything sorted before lunch. He told me he wanted independence, I said to the glass. He told me I was suffocating them. I'm just giving him some fresh air. I turned back to Nadine. Execute the documents, Nadine. All of them. Send the notice to quit by certified mail. I want the courier to place it directly in his hands. I want a signature required. Nadine typed for 20 minutes. The keys sounded like a machine gun in that quiet office. I sat there and watched the printer push out page after page of legal consequence. These weren't just papers. They were the conclusion of my son's childhood. He was 32, but his childhood was ending today, 10:45 a.m. on a Tuesday. She slid the stack of documents across the desk and offered me a pen. Heavy black rollerball. Read them carefully, Raymond. She said, her tone formal. Once you sign, the mechanism is in motion. I can't pull it back after the notice is served. I didn't read them. I knew what they said. I trusted Nadine. And more than that, I trusted my own resolve. I signed the first page, Raymond Whitlow, trustee. I signed the second, Raymond Whitlow, lender. I signed the third, Raymond Whitlow, father. That last signature was the hardest. My hand trembled for a fraction of a second, but I bore down, pressing the ink firmly into the page. I set the pen aside. It's done, I said. Nadine gathered the pages into a folder. She looked worn out. What are you going to do now? She asked. I stood, buttoned my jacket. Something felt different, lighter. The weight of the checkbook was gone. The burden of expectation had lifted. A strange, cold clarity had settled over me. "I'm going home," I said. "I'm going to finish sanding that bookshelf, and then I'm going to wait." "Wait for what?" "For the noise," I said. "They asked for peace. But when they open that envelope, they are going to make a great deal of noise. And for the first time in my life, I am not going to do a single thing to quiet it." I walked out of the office. I didn't look back. I took the elevator down to the garage, sat behind the wheel of my car, and gripped the steering wheel for a moment. I checked my phone. No new messages. Garrett was probably still waiting for my call about the car, assuming I was sulking that I'd come around. He had no idea I'd just terminated his position as my dependent. I turned the key. The old sedan came to life, steady as always. Reliable, sturdy. No pretense of being anything it wasn't. A lot like me. As I pulled out into the daylight, a single tear ran down my cheek. I wiped it away with the back of my hand. There would be no more of those. Tears belong to people who have run out of options. I hadn't run out of anything. I was the trustee, and I had just cleared the books. The next 7 days were the quietest stretch of my life. For the first time in 20 years, my phone didn't ring with an emergency. No texts about broken appliances. No panic over a late credit card payment. No guilt trips about how other grandfathers took their families on trips to Hawaii. Just silence, and it was magnificent. I woke at 6:00 a.m. Not because I needed to rush anywhere or worry about Garrett's finances, but because the sun was falling across the rhododendrons in my backyard, and I felt like making coffee. I took it out to the porch. I watched the steam climb from the mug and dissolve into the cool morning air. I realized I had spent decades living under a low-grade chronic stress, a constant background hum, and unending dread about what new crisis Garrett would generate next. Now the hum was gone. I started walking in the mornings, down to the pier watching the fishermen get their boats ready. I bought fresh salmon straight off the dock. I cooked real meals and actually sat at the dining table to eat them, rather than standing over the sink like a man too distracted to sit down. I even finished a book cover to cover, a biography of Dwight Eisenhower. One line stayed with me: "Do what you can with what you have where you are." I felt like Eisenhower would have understood exactly what I was doing. I was doing what I could with what I had to salvage my own dignity. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, I understood that the silence read very differently. To Garrett and Lucinda, my going quiet was a strategy. They figured I was sulking, sitting in the dark, regretting the torn check, waiting for an opening to come crawling back. They were probably telling people I was having some kind of episode. They had no idea that the notice to quit was already in a mail sorting facility, making its way to their front door like a slow-moving torpedo. It was Friday afternoon when the silence finally cracked. I was in the living room sorting through my old jazz CDs. I just put a Chet Baker jazz album on the turntable when the phone rang. The screen showed a photo of Owen. My chest jumped for a second, until I saw the name beneath the picture. Lucinda. I let it ring 3 times. I turned the volume down on the record player, but I didn't shut it off. I wanted that music in the background. It steadied me. It reminded me that I was in my home and I was the one in control. I swiped the screen. "Hello," I said. "Hi, Dad." Lucinda's voice came in high and bright, practically humming with forced warmth, the voice she used when something expensive was on the horizon. The voice of a predator wearing a cheerleader's uniform. "Hello, Lucinda." I didn't ask how she was. I didn't ask about Garrett. I simply waited. "So we haven't heard from you all week," she continued, gliding past the awkwardness. "We were getting a little concerned, with your blood pressure and everything. Just wanted to make sure you were doing all right." "I'm fine," I said. My blood pressure has actually been excellent this week. Oh, that is so good. That is so good. Listen, the reason I'm calling is we're finalizing the plans for Owen's birthday party next Saturday. Can you believe he's going to be 8 time flies, right? She paused, waiting for me to soften and go sentimental. I said nothing. Anyway, she pushed on the brightness at her edges, beginning to fray. We decided on a space theme this year. We've rented out the orbit zone at the mall, the one with laser tag and the arcade. It's going to be incredible. All his friends from private school are coming. That sounds nice for him, I said. Right. So here's the thing. The deposit is due today, and the catering has to be paid up front. Since you usually cover the birthday budget as your gift to Owen, I just wanted to make sure you were sending the transfer today. We were thinking $5,000 this year. The venue is a bit more exclusive, and we want to get him that new gaming console he's been asking for. $5,000. She said it the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. She had completely set aside the fact that 3 days ago I'd put her husband out of my house. She assumed the peace they wanted had nothing to do with my wallet. She assumed the Bank of Dad was still open despite the earlier robbery attempt. I took a slow sip of my tea. Darjeeling. Hot, soothing. I've already taken care of Owen's gift, I said evenly. A pause. I could hear her fingers on a keyboard in the background, checking their joint account. Oh, she said, her voice dropping a register. I'm looking at the Wells Fargo account right now, Dad. I don't see any transfer. Did you send it to Garrett's personal account? We use the joint one for household expenses. I didn't send it to Garrett's account, I said. And I didn't send it to the joint account. The typing stopped. What do you mean, did you send a check? You know the mail is slow, Dad. We need to pay the venue by $5,000 today, or we lose the reservation. I didn't send a check either, I said. Lucinda's patience gave out. The cheerful mask dropped away, and what emerged underneath was the entitled operator she actually was. Okay, Raymond, stop playing games. Where's the money? You promised Owen a good birthday. Are you really going to punish an 8-year-old boy because you had a little argument with Garrett that is low even for you? I settled back into my armchair. The Chet Baker saxophone solo was building toward its peak. I'm not punishing Owen, I said. I've given him the most valuable thing I possibly could. I put $10,000 into a 529 education savings plan in his name this morning. Silence. Total stunned silence. What? She asked, her voice flat. A 529 plan, I said again, speaking each word clearly. A tax-advantaged investment account for future education expenses. The money is locked in. It compounds until he turns 18 and can only be drawn for college tuition books or vocational training. But that doesn't help us right now, she cried out. Her voice cracked, the desperation breaking through. We need the money for the party. We already invited everyone. We promised Owen the party. Then you should pay for the party, I said. You and Garrett have jobs. You are parents. Parents pay for parties. Grandparents invest in futures. You can't do this, she snapped. We don't have $5,000 sitting around. We spent our liquidity on the down payment for other things. You have to undo it. Pull the money out of that ridiculous fund and transfer it to us, now. I cannot do that, Lucinda, I said, my tone firming. The fund is irrevocable. Even if I had the desire to reverse it, the penalties would be severe. But I have no such desire. For the first time, I know exactly where my money is landing. It's going to Owen, not to a party planner, not to a car dealership, not to your wardrobe. It goes to the boy. Oh, you are ruining everything, she screamed. You are a selfish, bitter old man. I'm going to tell Owen that his grandfather didn't care enough to give him a birthday party. I'm going to tell him you destroyed his birthday. Tell him whatever you like, I said. But when he's 18 and looking at a debt-free degree, he'll understand who actually cared about him. I'm putting Garrett on the phone, she threatened. He can't afford to talk to me right now, I said. He should probably save his energy for job hunting. What is that supposed to mean? She snapped. It means, Lucinda, that the party is over in every sense of those words. I hung up, not just a tap of the end call button. I set the phone face down on the table with a deliberateness that felt final. My heart was moving a little faster, but not from fear. Adrenaline. The rush of a man who held his ground for once. I lifted my tea again. My hand didn't shake. $10,000. Twice what they'd asked for, but unreachable. Beyond their grasp. They couldn't convert it into sushi dinners or designer bags. It was a fortified wall of cash built around my grandson's future, and they had no key to the gate. I let myself picture the scene at their place right now. Lucinda hurling her phone, Garrett pacing circles, dragging his hands through his hair. They were scrambling. They were beginning to feel the absence of the safety net they'd been bouncing on for 10 years. They'd have to cancel the fancy venue. Backyard party, homemade cake. A catastrophe for their social image, probably a better afternoon for an 8-year-old boy. But the real storm hadn't reached them yet. Right now, they were in a panic over a $5,000 deposit. They had no idea that Monday morning a courier would arrive with the notice to quit. They were fretting about losing a down payment on a bounce house. They didn't know they were about to lose the house itself. I took a slow breath and caught the smell of old record sleeves and fresh tea. This was what freedom tasted like. It tasted like the word no. I picked up the biography of Dwight Eisenhower again and turned the page. A whole weekend of quiet stretched ahead of me before the real war commenced on Monday. And for the first time in years, I was looking forward to it because this time, I already knew the outcome. Saturday came in with that aggressive, relentless sunshine that real estate agents pray for. The perfect light for a performance. While I sat on my porch 5 miles away, reading and drinking plain coffee, my son and his wife were staging the social event of the season in the backyard I had bought and paid for. I wasn't invited naturally. I was the ghost behind the feast, the invisible financier, whose money was essential, but whose face was considered a liability. I didn't need to be there to reconstruct the scene. I knew the layout of that house down to the last corner. I knew the way sound carried across that patio. And thanks to the security system I'd installed and kept the subscription running on, I could have watched every moment from my iPad. But I didn't. I didn't need the footage. I knew my son. I knew his wife. And I knew that pride inflates to its maximum size in the exact moment before it gets punctured. The backyard of the Ridgecrest Drive house was engineered for envy. That had been Lucinda's explicit instruction to the landscape architect 3 years back, not a garden, a statement. The hydrangeas were blue and enormous, chemically coaxed into artificial perfection. The lawn was trimmed to a precision that bordered on obsessive, and at the center of it all stood Garrett in a novelty apron flipping Wagyu burgers on a $3,000 Viking grill he had used exactly twice. He was playing the benevolent patriarch, laughing too hard at jokes that hadn't earned it, holding a sparkling water he didn't actually like, performing the role of a man who had built something from nothing. Lucinda held court near the fire pit. She had on a white linen dress that likely cost more than my first car, surrounded by her inner circle women, who all carried the same expensive highlights and the same quietly appraising eyes. There was Camille, whose husband was in hedge funds, and Nadira, who ran a boutique that never seemed to actually sell any clothes. They were working through mimosas made with the champagne I'd purchased for New Year's Eve but never got around to opening. I can hear Lucinda's voice in my head with perfect fidelity. She has a particular pitch when she's performing for an audience, a breathless musical quality calculated to make other people feel the distance between themselves and her. "We're thinking of expanding the patio come spring," she was saying, gesturing at the perfectly serviceable flagstone beneath her feet. "Garrett and I feel like the flow is just slightly off. We want to put in an outdoor kitchen with a pizza oven, something rustic but modern. We may have to take out that old oak tree to open up the space, but honestly, it drops too many leaves anyway." The old oak tree. The one I put in the ground with my late wife 30 years ago. The one Garrett used to climb when he was 6. To Lucinda, it was a debris problem standing between her and a pizza oven. Camille nodded, taking a slow sip of her drink. "That sounds incredible, lassie. Renovations are such a headache, though. We just wrapped up the pool house and I thought it would break me." "Oh, I know," Lucinda laughed, shaking her hair back. "But Garrett is so good with the contractors. He's very exacting, demands the best. We're actually looking at a vacation property in Sun Valley as well. Something modest for ski season. We just need a retreat. The pressure of managing all these assets is genuinely exhausting, you know." She released a long, theatrical sigh, the kind designed to solicit sympathy for the hardship of apparent wealth. Nadira leaned in. "Speaking of stress, where's Garrett's dad? I always thought he came to these things." "He's usually around." Lucinda rolled her eyes. The gesture was well practiced, a calibrated performance of patient suffering. "Oh, Raymond, we finally had to draw some boundaries. It was just becoming too much. He means well, I suppose, in his way. But he's so needy. He shows up without calling. He second-guesses our parenting. He tries to fix things that don't need fixing. We had to be honest with him, we need our space. We're focusing on our immediate family right now. It's healthier this way." "Good for you," Camille said. "Toxic family dynamics are such a drain. You have to guard your peace." "Exactly," Lucinda said, lifting her glass. "To peace and to not having to sit through 3 hours of stories about bridge engineering." They all laughed. It was a small, bright, cruel sound that drifted over the fence into the neighbor's yard. They were toasting my absence, toasting the freedom of spending my money without having to look at my face. Garrett glanced over from the grill and smiled across at them. Maybe he didn't catch the insult, or maybe he did and let it slide. He was too busy inhabiting the dream. In his mind, he was the undisputed master of this domain, the provider, the man whose efforts made all of this real. What he had conveniently edited out was that the stakes on that grill, the propane feeding the flame, and the very earth under his feet were all underwritten by the old man they were busy ridiculing. The party had hit its stride. Someone's curated playlist of soft yacht rock floated through the warm air. The scent of expensive beef mingled with charcoal smoke. Everything looked flawless. Everything felt locked in. And then reality announced itself. Not quietly. What arrived was the unmistakable heavy growl of a diesel engine. A large white truck, purple and orange lettering down the side, rolled up to the curb and blocked the driveway clean. Air brakes exhaled with a sharp hiss that cut straight through the music. A FedEx driver climbed out. He wasn't in linen. He was in shorts and a uniform dark with sweat. He moved up the driveway at a clip, carrying a flat, rigid cardboard envelope, the kind whose shape alone telegraphs legal documents. Garrett glanced up from the grill. A frown crossed his face. He hadn't ordered anything. He wiped his palms on his apron and headed toward the gate. He tried to look unbothered, but there's a particular low-level dread that never quite leaves people who are living beyond their means when an uninvited stranger appears at the door. He met the driver at the patio's edge. "Garrett Whitlow?" the driver asked, eyes on his handheld scanner. "Yeah, that's me," Garrett said. "Can you keep it down? We've got guests." "Can here," the driver said, unmoved by the social situation. Priority overnight. Signature required. Garrett scrawled his name across the screen. The driver passed him the envelope. It was heavy. It was rigid. And it had a red sticker across the front that read, "Urgent, do not bend." The driver turned, walked back to the truck. The engine grumbled back to life, found a gear, and pulled away, trailing a curl of exhaust that drifted lazily across the manicured lawn. Garrett stood there holding the envelope. He should have tucked it inside, should have let the guests go home first. But curiosity is its own kind of trap. And underneath curiosity, fear runs deeper still. He checked the return address. Harcourt Legal Group, Attorneys at Law. Nadine. Garrett's heart must have stumbled in his chest. He knew Nadine. He knew she was my lawyer. His first thought was probably the check. He probably figured I'd come around, decided I was being unreasonable over the car repair, and sent a cashier's check through counsel to preserve some dignity. A faint smile found his mouth. He thought he'd come out on top. He angled his back toward the guests, using his body to block the envelope from view. He pulled the tear tab on the side. The cardboard split with a crisp, zipping tear. He slid out the documents. 3 of them. The first was not a check. It was a formal letter printed on heavy cream-colored stationery. At the top, in bold capital letters, 3 words sat on the page and changed the atmospheric pressure of the entire afternoon. Notice to quit. Garrett blinked. Read it again. His mind wouldn't take it in. Notice to quit. That was language for landlords dealing with tenants who'd stopped paying rent. That was something that happened to other people. That did not happen to Garrett Whitlow, Vice President of Business Development, owner of the Viking Grill. He read the first paragraph. Dear Mr. Whitlow, please be advised that your status as a resident beneficiary of the property located at 2445 Ridgecrest Drive is hereby revoked effective immediately pursuant to Clause 14B of the Whitlow Family Trust. You are hereby required to vacate the premises and surrender possession of the property to the trustee Raymond Whitlow within 30 days of receipt of this notice. Failure to vacate will result in immediate eviction proceedings. The color started leaving Garrett's face. It didn't go all at once. It pulled back from his lips, first draining them to a pale ashen gray, then swept across his cheeks. His hands began to tremble. The paper shivered in the faint breeze. He turned quickly to the second document. Maybe there was an error. Maybe this was some kind of mistake. The second document was worse. Notice of intent to sell real property. This notice serves to inform you that the property is being listed for sale on the open market. A real estate photographer will arrive Monday at 9:00 a.m. to document the interior and exterior of the home. As the current occupant, you are required by law to maintain the property in show-ready condition and to allow access to prospective buyers with 24 hours notice. Selling. That word landed like a fist to the gut. We were selling the house, his house, the one he'd been telling his friends he planned to expand. The house where he was at this very moment hosting a party to toast his own success. He moved to the third document. It was a copy of the promissory note for the kitchen renovation. $40,000. Stamped across the front in red ink, one word. Default. Garrett felt the ground shift under him. The smell of the burgers suddenly turned his stomach. The laughter from the guests sounded wrong, warped, like it was filtering up from underwater. He swept his eyes across the yard. Camille was bent over the hydrangeas, admiring them. Nadira was freshening her mimosa. He saw the whole illusion he'd constructed, and he saw the demolition crew already pulling up to the gate. 30 days. He didn't have 30 days. He didn't have $30,000. His credit cards were at their limits. His savings account was empty. He had an expectant wife who was already planning a vacation home in Sun Valley, and he was holding a letter informing him he was about to be without a roof. Right then, Lucinda's voice sliced through the fog of his panic. "Babe, who was that?" Garrett flinched. He jammed the papers back into the torn envelope, shoved the envelope into the deep front pocket of his apron. It didn't sit right. The corner jutted out stiff and accusatory against the fabric. He turned to face her. He attempted a smile. It came out wrong, eyes too wide and frightened mouth forced into something meant to read as relaxed. "Oh, just a courier," he managed. His voice had climbed a full octave. Lucinda walked toward him. She looked mildly annoyed that he'd wandered from the grill. "Well, obviously it was a courier, Garrett. What did they want? Is it the contract for the new downtown high-rise? Did you land the deal?" She was handing him a lifeline, offering up a lie on a silver tray because she wanted the moment. She wanted to pivot to Camille and Nadira and say, "Look at my husband closing million-dollar deals on a Saturday." Garrett looked at her. He looked at the expectant faces turned his way. He looked at the fiction he'd been living inside, and he leaned in harder. "Yeah," he said, his voice catching just slightly. "Yeah, that's it. The downtown project just needed a signature. Big stuff. Very urgent." Lucinda lit up. She brought her hands together. "I told you guys," she sang out, spinning back toward her friends. "He is unstoppable. We are absolutely celebrating tonight. Champagne is on us." The guests erupted. Camille lifted her glass. "To Garrett, to the Rainmaker." Garrett gave a limp nod. "To me." He breathed. He turned back to the grill, picked up the spatula. His grip was shaking badly enough that he nearly fumbled it. He stared down at the burgers. They were burning, fat dripping onto the coals, kicking up jets of orange flame. He watched the meat blacken at the edges. He felt like he was charring right alongside them. The envelope pressed into his thigh through the apron fabric. It felt warm. It felt like something radioactive. 30 days. He looked over at Lucinda, who was laughing at something Nadira had said, completely unaware. She was still sketching out plans for pizza ovens and ski weekends. She had no idea that the ground beneath her heels had already been sold out from under her. She had no idea her husband wasn't a rainmaker. He was a squatter. Garrett felt a wave of dizziness roll through him. He grabbed the grill handle to keep himself upright. He needed a drink, a strong one, but he couldn't walk away. He was the host. He had to stand there flipping expensive meat for people he barely tolerated, while his entire life quietly came apart in his pocket. The sun pressed down on him. The heat off the grill blasted his face. Sweat was running freely now, stinging at the corners of his eyes. "You okay, hun?" Lucinda called over. "You look a little flushed." "I'm fine," Garrett croaked. Just the heat from the fire." It wasn't the heat. It was the hell I had just walked him into. And the worst of it for him wasn't the fear of losing the house. It wasn't the fear of financial ruin. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of the secret itself. He had to get through the rest of this party. Had to keep smiling. Had to keep serving burgers. Had to keep pretending. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I thought about that text message. "We want peace." What's coming next changed everything. Not just for the people in this story, but for the way I think about what it means to protect someone you love. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone close to you had been quietly living off your generosity while looking down on you for it, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait and let the truth do its own work? "Well, son," I thought, turning another page on my quiet porch. "Enjoy the party. Because tomorrow the peace ends and the eviction begins. The FedEx truck had long since gone, but the damage was done. The first domino had tipped, and Garrett, standing there in that ridiculous apron, was the only one who could hear the rest of them already clicking into motion. It was just past 11:00 at night when headlights swept across my living room wall. I was settled into my leather armchair, the house dark, apart from the small reading lamp throwing light across the pages of my book. Outside, a storm had rolled in off the coast, driving sheets of rain against the windows. The thunder was considerable, but not as loud as the engine that revved hard into my driveway. I didn't need to glance out the window to know who it was. I recognized the aggression in that engine. I knew the way those car doors shut, not the quiet click of arrival, but the heavy, deliberate thud of barely contained fury. I closed my book, set it down on the side table beside my cold cup of tea. I didn't rise from the chair. I didn't go to the door. I sat and waited. I wanted them to come to me. I wanted them to cross into my sanctuary and drag their chaos into the light where I could take it apart piece by piece. The pounding started seconds later. It wasn't a knock. It was a physical attack on the wood. Bam. 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 Open the door! Garrett's voice cracked and raw, fighting against the wind and the rain. Open the door right now, Dad. I took a long breath. I smoothed the fabric of my trousers. Then slowly and deliberately, I walked to the entryway. I turned this deadbolt. I didn't throw the door wide open. I turned the handle and drew it back just far enough to let them see me. They looked like a disaster. Garrett was drenched. His expensive dress shirt clung to his chest, translucent and miserable. His hair, which he normally set with gel to careful precision, was dripping water down into his eyes. Lucinda stood just behind him, trembling in her thin linen dress, arms locked tight across her chest. Her mascara had tracked down both cheeks in dark, jagged streaks, giving her the look of a weeping doll. Neither of them waited to be invited in. Garrett shouldered past me hard enough that I stumbled back half a step. Lucinda followed, pulling a gust of cold, wet air in with her, that mix of expensive perfume and ozone straight into my hallway. "You are insane," Garrett shouted. He wheeled around to face me, water flicking off his hair onto my hardwood floor. "You are actually legally insane. Do you know what you did today? Do you have any idea what you did?" I closed the door. Turned the deadbolt again. The click rang out sharply in the sudden quiet of the hallway. "I know exactly what I did," I said. My voice was low, the voice of an engineer explaining calmly why a bridge had to be shut down for structural reasons. "I sent a legal notice. I trust you received it." "Received it?" Lucinda shrieked. She stepped out from behind Garrett. Her eyes were somewhere past wild. "Received it. A FedEx driver handed it to my husband in the middle of a party. In front of everyone. In front of Camille. In front of Nadira. We were humiliated. Raymond humiliated us." She was trembling, but not from the cold. She was trembling with the indignation of a queen who had been handed her own bill at the end of a banquet. "We had to clear everyone out," Garrett shouted, pacing the entryway. His wet shoes squeaked with every step. "We had to tell them I'd come down sick. Do you know how that looked? I looked like an idiot. And then I opened the envelope and found this. This garbage." He drove his hand into his apron pocket and yanked out the rain-soaked, crumpled documents. He hurled them at me. They fluttered to the floor, wet and limp. "Notice to quit." He spat the words like something bitter. "Are you kidding me? You can't evict us, Dad. We are family. You can't treat us like tenants." I looked down at the papers where they'd landed. I left them there. I am treating you exactly like tenants, I said, because that is what you are. Bad tenants. Tenants who damage property, disrespect the owner, and refuse to pay what they owe. It is our house. Lucinda's voice was nearly a scream. She closed the distance between us, getting right up into my face. I could see the veins standing out along her neck. How dare you call yourself the landlord? We lived there. We made that house a home. I painted the nursery. I picked the backsplash for the kitchen. I planted those hydrangeas. That makes it ours. I looked at her. I looked at the conviction in her eyes. She genuinely believed that choosing a paint color at a hardware store transferred legal ownership of $1 million asset. Lucinda, I said, keeping my hands folded behind my back. Painting a wall does not hand you the deed. Choosing a backsplash does not sign the mortgage. You have lived there for 5 years rent-free. That was a gift, a privilege, and today that privilege expired. You can't do this, Garrett cut in, his voice unsteady. The law won't allow it. We have rights. We have squatters' rights or occupancy rights. You cannot put a family out on the street. I nearly laughed. Squatters' rights. He was reaching for legal terminology he'd half remembered from some television drama. I'd suggest you read those documents again, I said. I didn't draft them. Nadine Harcourt did, and Nadine doesn't make mistakes. The house is held by the Whitlow Family Trust. I am the sole trustee. You are listed as resident beneficiaries. Clause 14b states plainly that the trustee may revoke residency at any time if the beneficiary's conduct is deemed detrimental to the estate. Detrimental to the estate! Garrett's voice cracked upward. What did we do? What could we possibly have done that qualifies as detrimental? We are raising your grandson. We are living our lives. You demanded money I didn't owe you. You said we disrespected you in your own house. You told us to stay away. You told us you wanted peace. Well, Garrett, this is what peace looks like. Peace is me protecting this estate from people who drain it dry. This is about the car, isn't it? Lucinda hissed. She swiped the mascara from her cheek with the back of her hand. This whole thing is because Garrett asked you to cover the transmission. My God, you are petty. You are a petty, vindictive old man. You are doing all of this just to make a point. Fine message received. We will pay for the stupid car. Just phone the lawyers and call off the eviction. She looked at me waiting. She thought she was negotiating. She thought she could pitch a few $1,000s at the problem and watch it dissolve the way they'd always done before. It is not about the car, I said. The car was the trigger. The gun has been loaded for years. I stepped past them into the living room. I needed the space. The smell of their entitlement was pressing in on me. Where are you going? Garrett called, coming after me. Don't walk away. We are not finished. I turned around near the fireplace. We are finished, Garrett. The notice gives you 30 days. You have 29 left. I'd recommend spending less time shouting in my hallway and more time searching for an apartment. You are selling it. His voice dropped to just above a whisper. I saw the second notice. You are actually going to sell the house. Yes, I said. The photographer arrives Monday morning. I expect the property to be presentable. If it isn't, I'll bring in a cleaning crew and take the cost out of the final trust accounting. You can't sell it, he said, and now the rage had given way to something closer to pleading. We were going to extend the patio. We were going to put in a pizza oven. It is our dream house, Dad. Then you should have purchased it, I said, and my voice was flat and cold. But you didn't. I did. With money I earned working 60-hour weeks while you were in college playing video games. I bought it to give you a foundation, not to hand you a permanent free ride. We added value, Lucinda called from the hallway. We renovated that kitchen. The marble countertop alone was $12,000. We put our own money into that house. Your own money? I asked. Or the $40,000 I loaned you 2 years ago, the loan you never repaid? Silence. Her mouth opened and closed with nothing coming out. That's right, I continued. I remember that loan. I remember the promissory note. And here's what that means in the final accounting. You owe me $40,000 plus interest. If the house sells at a profit, I may be generous enough to apply your debt against the proceeds. But don't wait on a check. You are underwater, Lucinda. You simply haven't felt yourself drowning yet. Garrett dropped onto the sofa, my leather sofa. He buried his face in his wet hands. He looked diminished. He looked like the boy who used to show up at my door after breaking a neighbor's window with a baseball expecting me to make it right. But I wasn't the fixer anymore. I was the demolition crew. Dad, please, he wept, shoulders heaving. You can't do this to Owen. He loves his room. He loves that house. If we have to move, he'll have to change schools. He'll lose all his friends. Do you actually want to hurt your grandson? Is that what you're after? The weaponization of the child. I knew it was coming. It was always the last card they played. The human shield. Owen will be fine, I said, keeping my voice level even as my heart pulled at the sound of his name. Owen is resilient. What Owen needs isn't a fancy bedroom or a private school his grandfather quietly funds. What he needs is to watch his father stand on his own feet, to see his parents face something hard and come through it instead of just taking and demanding. You are ruining his life, Lucinda screamed. She charged into the room and planted herself over Garrett, shielding him. You are a monster. You are jealous because we are young and happy and you are old and alone. That is what this really is. You want us to be as miserable as you are. I looked at them, young and happy. They were anything but. They were drowning in debt, performing for people who didn't care about them, and quietly terrified of a future they had never once prepared for. I am not miserable, Lucinda, I said. I am free. And soon you will be free too. Free of the weight of a house you cannot afford. Free of the fiction that you are wealthy. It will be hard. It will hurt. But it might just be the thing that saves you. Saves us. Garrett looked up. His eyes were red and swollen. You are destroying us. I will lose my job. If there's an eviction judgment against me, my company will see it in the background check, Dad. I work in finance and construction. I cannot have a lien on my record. Then I'd start packing, I said. Because the clock is already running. He got to his feet. The grief in his eyes evaporated, replaced by something colder and harder. The anger of an entitled man discovering that the world does not bend to his will. Fine, he said. You want a war? You've got one. We won't go. We will fight the eviction every step of the way. We will drag this through the courts for months. It takes 6 months to evict a family in this state, Dad. I looked it up. And in the meantime, you will not see Owen. Not one single time. You will never lay eyes on him again. I nodded slowly. I had expected this too. You can try, I said. But remember who controls the resources. I have Nadine Harcourt. I have the means to sustain this for 10 years, if it comes to that. Can you afford a retainer? Can you cover the court fees? Or will you be passing a hat to Camille and Nadira? Garrett flinched. And as for Owen, I continued lowering my voice to something quieter and more deliberate. If you use that boy as a bargaining chip, if you try to cut me off from him, I will petition for grandparents' rights. And I will bring the financial records into that courtroom. I will lay out every piece of the instability. I will show them that you are bankrupt and facing homelessness. Who do you think the judge will favor, the solvent grandfather with a trust fund or the father with maxed out cards and no savings? Unemployed. Garrett's brow creased. I am not unemployed. I looked at him with something close to genuine pity. Check your email Monday morning, son. What did you do? He moved toward me, panic climbing back into his voice. Then I am the silent partner, Garrett, I said. The investor group that backs your firm. That is me. That is my capital. I pulled my funding yesterday. The restructuring begins Monday. He stood there and stared. The horror was absolute. He had the look of a man watching the earth split open directly beneath his feet. You fired me. I didn't fire you, I said. I simply stopped paying for your position. There's a distinction. If you are everything you claim to be, if you are the rainmaker, some other firm will be lining up to sign you. Won't they? He didn't answer. He already knew the truth. He'd always known he was ordinary. He'd known since day one that the job existed because I made a phone call 5 years ago. Get out, I said. They didn't move. Get out of my house, I said. And this time I let the full weight of it come out. The sound filled the room, striking the walls, startling them both. Lucinda grabbed Garrett's arm. Come on, she said, her voice cracking. Let's go. He has lost his mind. He is actually crazy. We'll call a lawyer first thing in the morning. We'll sue him for everything. She pulled him toward the door. Garrett stumbled, turning to look back at me over his shoulder. He looked like a stranger to me. I hate you, he whispered. I know, I said. They walked out into the rain. The door didn't slam this time. It didn't catch in the wind. I crossed the room and pushed it shut myself. Threw the deadbolt. Click. I rested my forehead against the cool wood. My heart was driving hard against my ribs. My hands were still trembling. I was not built for this. I was a builder by nature, not a fighter. I wanted to repair things, not reduce them to rubble. But sometimes when the foundation has rotted all the way through, the only way to fix it is to bring the whole structure down first. I switched off the porch light. I went back to my chair. The tea was cold. The book lay open at the same page. The silence settled back over the house, but it wore a different character now. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful morning. It was the weighted, charged stillness of a battlefield after the first cannons have spoken. They were gone, but the war had only just opened. I picked up my tea and took a sip. It was bitter. Good, I whispered to the empty room. I sat there in the dark and listened to the rain erase their tire tracks from the driveway. 5 miles away, my son and his wife were driving back to a house that didn't belong to them, heading for a bed they didn't own, moving toward a future they had never once seen coming. Monday was going to be a very long day. Monday morning landed like a gavel, striking the bench sharp final and calling everything to order. While I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee watching rain trace lines down the glass, 2 disasters were unfolding simultaneously 5 miles away. I wasn't there to watch either of them. But I had written the schedule. I knew it by heart. At 8:55 a.m. on Ridgecrest Drive, Lucinda was on her knees scrubbing a wine stain from the white marble countertop, looking like a woman teetering at the edge of a breakdown. She was still in her silk pajamas, hair piled in a frantic bun, muttering under her breath. The house that had been her monument to status now pressed in around her, like a cell that was slowly getting smaller. She had ignored the email from the real estate agency. She had deleted the voicemail from the photographer. She had persuaded herself that if she refused to acknowledge the appointment, it simply wouldn't materialize. She believed she could barricade herself inside her own denial. But denial has no effect on electronic locks. At exactly 9:00 a.m., a black sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman in a crisp navy blazer stepped out. This was not just any listing agent. This was Paige, a woman Lucinda had known since college. A woman Lucinda had spent the better part of 5 years trying to outshine at every turn. A woman who had finished runner-up for Homecoming Queen the year Lucinda took the crown. And now Paige was the one holding the master key. Lucinda froze at the kitchen window the moment she saw her. The sponge slipped from her hand. She didn't move. She just watched as Paige came up the front path, a photographer behind her, carrying a tripod and a heavy camera bag. The doorbell rang. It echoed through the house like a summons from a court she couldn't adjourn. Lucinda didn't answer. She pressed herself back from the door, barely breathing. Then came the keypad. Beep, 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 beep. Click. The front door swung open. Hello. Paige's voice came in bright and professional. Listing agent, we have a scheduled photography appointment. Lucinda rushed into the hallway, yanking her robe tight around herself. You cannot come in here, she snapped. Get out. This is private property. Paige stopped. She took Lucinda in slowly, the stained pajamas, the wild eyes, the sharp undertone of bleach and panic. A measured, pitying smile settled across her face. Lucinda, she said evenly. I didn't realize you'd be home. The trustee, Mr. Whitlow, indicated the house would be empty for the shoot. But since you're here, perhaps you could move that laundry pile off the sofa. We need the wide-angle shot. While Lucinda was standing face-to-face with her old rival across town, inside the glass-walled headquarters of Summit Construction Group, Garrett was stepping toward the elevator. He looked wrecked. He hadn't slept. His eyes were raw and red, and he'd nicked himself shaving. But he had on his best suit. He was working to project stability. He told himself the weekend had been a nightmare, nothing more. He told himself his father wouldn't actually follow through, that he was bluffing, that he always backed down in the end. Garrett pressed the button for the 14th floor. He checked himself in the polished metal doors, straightened his tie. I am the rainmaker, he murmured. I am essential. The elevator chimed. He walked out into the open floor. He expected the usual nod from the receptionist. He expected his team standing by with coffee and status reports. Instead, the receptionist found something urgent to study on her desk as he passed. The office was quiet. Unnervingly quiet. People were at their keyboards, but their eyes kept cutting toward him and snapping back away. It had the atmosphere of a wake. Garrett moved to his office. He reached for the handle. Locked. He frowned. He held his keycard to the reader. The light blinked red. Denied. He tried again. Red. Denied. Hey, Petra! He called to his assistant seated barely 10 feet away. My card must be demagnetized. Can you buzz me in? Petra didn't get up. She looked at him with the expression of someone delivering bad news to a stranger. I can't, Garrett, she said quietly. Mr. Davenport wants you in the boardroom. Right now. Back at the house, the occupation was well underway. The photographer had set up lights in the living room and was repositioning Lucinda's carefully arranged throw pillows as though they were clutter. Flash after flash was firing, cataloging every corner of the space she had always called hers. Lucinda had been backed into the kitchen by Paige. You cannot do this, Paige, Lucinda hissed. We are not selling. My father-in-law is in the middle of a mental health crisis. He is confused. We are clearing this up with our lawyers today. You need to go. Paige opened the folder she was carrying. She drew out a single sheet and set it on the counter. It doesn't look like confusion to me, Lassie, she said, tapping the page with a manicured finger. I have a signed listing agreement from the title holder Raymond Whitlow, trustee, and a copy of the notice to quit that was served to you on Saturday. She looked up, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite sympathy. Honestly, it is a little sad, she went on. Everyone in our circle assumed you two owned this place. You always spoke about it that way, my kitchen, my garden. But you were just occupants the whole time. That must be mortifying. It is ours, Lucinda snapped. We are the beneficiaries. Were, Paige said with a small correction. Past tense. The listing reads, trustee sale vacant possession. That means you are on your way out. Paige let her gaze drift around the kitchen. She ran one finger along the marble island. You know the market is a bit sluggish right now, she said, as though making idle conversation. But since this is a distress sale, we priced it aggressively. I actually have a buyer coming to walk through in 20 minutes. An investor. He is looking for a rental property. She tilted her head. You two could always try to rent it back from him. Though given your credit profile, probably not. Lucinda felt the tears threatening. She wanted to scream. She wanted to wipe the composed look clean off Paige's face. But she couldn't, because Paige was right. Paige had the paperwork. Paige had the authority. And Lucinda was a woman standing in silk pajamas inside a house that was being sold out from beneath her feet. Meanwhile, up on the 14th floor, the boardroom air conditioning was running steadily, but Garrett was drenched in sweat. He sat at the long mahogany table. At the head of it sat Mr. Davenport, the CEO. Davenport was a man of few words and fewer visible feelings. He had a file open in front of him. Garrett, Davenport said without looking up. We are making some structural changes to the firm. Garrett let out a short, uneasy laugh. Structural changes. That sounds ominous. Listen, I have some good news on the downtown project. I think I can pull another 5% margin out of the subcontractors. Davenport finally raised his eyes. They were flat. You are not hearing me, Garrett. We are restructuring. Specifically, we are liquidating your position. Garrett went still. His expression cracked. Liquidating, what does that mean? I am the VP of Business Development. I bring in the deals. I am the face of this company. You were the face of a specific capital stream, Davenport said. He slid a document across the table. Garrett looked down at it. It was a withdrawal notice from a private equity fund, the fund that had put $2 million into the company 5 years ago, the fund that carried the payroll for the entire expansion division. We received this on Saturday, Davenport said. Our primary silent investor has invoked his right to withdraw capital due to loss of confidence in management, specifically loss of confidence in you. In me, Garrett said. Let me talk to them. I can sort this out. I can get anyone back on side. Who is it? Is it the group out of New York? Davenport shook his head. He turned the last page of the document and rotated it so Garrett could read the signature at the bottom. Not a corporate stamp, a handwritten signature in black ink, a signature Garrett had seen on his report cards, on his college tuition checks, on his car insurance forms. Raymond Whitlow. Garrett stared at it. The letters seemed to move. My dad, he whispered. My dad is the investor. He is the majority backer of the shell company that funds you. Yes, Davenport said. He stipulated 5 years ago that his investment was contingent on your employment. He wanted to give you a window to prove yourself. And now, Garrett asked, his voice barely there. Davenport closed the file. Now he says the experiment is finished. He pulled his funding effective immediately. Without that capital, we cannot sustain your salary, your expense account, or your department. But I am good at this, Garrett said, rising to his feet. I have built real relationships. Davenport sighed. He removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly. Let's be honest, Garrett. You spent money. You took clients to expensive dinners, you played golf, the actual engineering, the actual deal closing. That was your team. You were a figurehead your father was paying for, and now the check has stopped. Davenport reached over and pressed the intercom. Security, please come to the boardroom. Garrett's legs gave out under him. He sat back down hard. He fired me, he said softly. My own father fired me. He didn't fire you, Davenport said. He simply stopped paying us to keep you on. Back on Ridgecrest Drive, the doorbell sounded again. Paige glanced at her watch. Right on time, she said brightly. So thought that will be the buyer. Lucinda, you might want to head upstairs. Sellers being present is never a good look, especially dressed the way you are. Lucinda held her ground for a moment, shaking with fury. Get out, she said in a low voice. Paige didn't acknowledge it. She walked to the front door and pulled it open wide. Welcome. Come on in. The light in here is beautiful right now. A man stepped inside. He wore a plain suit and carried a clipboard. He took in the entryway with an assessing eye. Nice floors, he said. Hardwood or laminate. Imported oak, Lucinda called from the kitchen, unable to stop herself. The man looked over, surprised. Oh, I thought the unit was vacant. It will be very shortly, Paige said smoothly. Don't mind her. She's on her way out. Lucinda watched them move into the living room. Paige was walking him through the fireplace, the high ceilings, the crown molding, narrating Lucinda's life to a stranger who was sizing it up like a line item on a spreadsheet. And then the final indignity arrived. Let's go up and see the master bedroom, Paige said, guiding the man toward the staircase. The walk-in closet alone is worth the trip. No. Lucinda moved fast, planting herself at the foot of the stairs. You are not going up there. My things are on the floor. My bed isn't made. Paige paused on the third step. She looked back down at Lucinda. Whatever sharpness had been in her expression was gone now. What replaced it was something colder and more final. Then you should have tidied up, Paige said. But since you didn't, we are going up anyway, because you no longer get to set the terms here, Lucinda. You are a guest who stayed far too long. She turned and continued up the stairs. The man followed. Lucinda stood at the bottom and listened to their footsteps moving across the carpet above her. She heard the door to her bedroom ease open. She heard the man say, "Bit musty in here, isn't it?" Lucinda crumpled onto the bottom step. She pressed her face into her knees. From upstairs came the steady clicking of the camera shutter, cataloging the disorder of her life for strangers to scroll past on the internet. At that exact moment, 2 security guards stepped into the boardroom at Summit Construction Group. "Mr. Whitlow," one of them said, extending a cardboard box. "We've cleared your desk. Personal items only. Company laptop and phone have been retained." Garrett looked at the box. It was small. Inside sat a framed photo of him and Lucinda in Sun Valley, a stress ball, and a half-empty bottle of cologne. 5 years of a career compressed into something that weighed less than 5 pounds. "You can't do this," Garrett said, his voice thin. "I need to call my dad." "You can call him from the lobby," Davenport said, getting to his feet. "Please escort Mr. Whitlow out of the building and collect his access badge." One guard moved in and unclipped the badge from Garrett's belt. It was a quick, practiced motion. Garrett felt a tug at his waist, and then he was untethered. No longer vice president, just a man in a suit holding a box. He stood. He walked to the door. He looked back at Davenport. Tell him. Tell him he is destroying my life. Davenport kept his eyes on his paperwork. He didn't look up. I believe that is precisely the message he intended to send you, Garrett. Garrett walked out into the hallway. The march to the elevator felt like a procession. People watched. They murmured. They already knew. The office grapevine moves faster than light. The prince had fallen. The safety net had been cut. The elevator ride down lasted 30 seconds. 30 seconds to drop 14 floors. 30 seconds to travel from the top of the world to the pavement. When the doors opened in the lobby, the gray glare of the outside world waited for him. It was still raining. He had no umbrella. He walked out onto the sidewalk. The rain went through his suit in seconds. It wrecked his hair. It ran cold down the back of his neck. He stood on the corner, gripping his cardboard box, and pulled out his phone. He dialed my number. I was at my kitchen table. I watched his name light up the screen. I didn't pick up. I let it ring. I looked out at the rain falling on my garden and thought about the first time I taught Garrett to ride a bike. I had let go of the seat. He wobbled badly. He was frightened. He screamed for me to hold on, but I knew that holding on meant he would never find his own balance, so I let him fall. He scraped his knee, he cried, but the next day he rode. This fall was going to be harder. The scrape would go much deeper. The phone stopped. A minute passed and it rang again. Lucinda this time. I didn't answer that one either. I sat with the image of them both. Garrett soaked and jobless on a street corner. Lucinda on the stairs, humiliated and exposed. The two pillars of their perfect life had come down at the same hour. I took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. I picked up my pen and notepad. I had a list in front of me. Cancel the car insurance. Cancel the country club membership. I drew a line through Summit Investment. I drew a line through house showing. 2 down, 3 to go. I wasn't doing any of this out of hatred. I was doing it out of necessity. This was surgery. And surgery involves blood. I looked at the phone one last time. Welcome to the real world, kids, I said quietly to the empty kitchen. Then I switched off the ringer, picked up my book, and went back to reading. The silence in the house was complete. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like justice. The conference room at Harcourt Legal Group was designed to make people feel small. It occupied the 42nd floor with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city I had spent a career helping to build. But the atmosphere inside was airless. The air conditioning hummed with a low, unsettling pitch. The mahogany table stretched the length of the room, polished to a mirror finish, throwing back distorted reflections of everyone seated around it. On one side sat my son Garrett and his wife Lucinda. They looked as though they had aged a decade in 48 hours. Garrett had on a suit that had gone slightly to wrinkle. His shirt collar was open, his tie loosened. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared instead at his own hands, laced tightly on the table knuckles, blanched white. Lucinda wore oversized sunglasses indoors. She sat with her arms locked across her chest, projecting a compound of fury and barely contained fear. Next to them sat their attorney, a man named Mr. Grady. I knew Grady by reputation. He was a strip mall lawyer whose practice ran to personal injury cases and loud, hollow threats. The fact that they could only afford Grady told me everything I needed to know about where their finances stood. On the other side of the table sat Nadine Harcourt and me. Nadine was the picture of composed lethality. She had a single thick black binder on the table in front of her. She hadn't opened it. She simply rested one hand on it, calm and proprietary, as though it contained the deed to everything in the room. I sat beside her in silence, watching the storm build over the city skyline. Grady cleared his throat, a nervous sound. "Let's not waste anyone's time," he said, reaching for a tone of authority. "My clients are the victims of a sudden and malicious eviction attempt. Mr. Whitlow here, in spite of being the biological father, has acted with extreme prejudice. We are advancing a claim of constructive trust. We are claiming equitable interest. Garrett and Lucinda have resided in that property for 5 years. They have treated it as their own. They have put their blood, sweat, and tears into it. You cannot remove them from their home over a family disagreement." He sat back, apparently satisfied with his opening. Nadine didn't blink. She didn't even glance at Grady. She looked directly at Garrett. "Blood, sweat, and tears," she said quietly. "That is an evocative phrase, Mr. Grady. Courts, however, prefer receipts." She opened the black binder. The snap of the metal rings cut through the room like a small gunshot. Lucinda pulled off her sunglasses. Her eyes were red at the rims. "We renovated the kitchen," she blurted, her voice climbing. "Oh, I told you we put in marble. We landscaped the garden. That adds value. That makes us partners in that property." Nadine turned to the first page of the binder and ran a finger down a column of figures. "Let's talk about value," she said, "and specifically about who provided it." She produced a spreadsheet. It was color-coded, granular, and merciless. It was a forensic autopsy of their lifestyle. "How much is it okay?" Nadine said, sliding a copy across the table toward Grady. "A comprehensive ledger of every household expense for the property on Ridgecrest Drive over the past 60 months. Grady picked up the paper. His frown arrived almost immediately. Nadine began to read. Her voice carried no inflection. It was the voice of a machine tabulating damage. "Mortgage payments, principal, and interest. $5,200 per month paid by Raymond Whitlow. Total over 5 years, $312,000. She looked up. "Did you contribute to any of that, Garrett?" Garrett gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No." "Property taxes," Nadine continued. "State and local assessments averaging $12,000 per year paid by Raymond Whitlow. Total over 5 years, $60,000. Lucinda shifted in her seat. That is normal. Parents support their children." Nadine moved on without acknowledging her. "Homeowners insurance, flood insurance, earthquake insurance paid by Raymond Whitlow. Total $18,000. She turned the page. The sound of it was the only noise in the room. "Maintenance and repairs," Nadine said. "New HVAC system installed in 2020 cost $14,000 paid by Raymond Whitlow. Roof repair in 2021 cost $8,000 paid by Raymond Whitlow. Weekly landscaping, monthly pool service, pest control, security system monitoring, all paid by Raymond Whitlow." She paused and turned her gaze directly on Lucinda. "You mentioned the garden, Lucinda, the hydrangeas. According to this invoice from Greenleaf Landscaping, the installation carried a cost of $3,000. The check was signed by Raymond Whitlow. You didn't plant them. You pointed to a catalog and my client wrote the check." Lucinda's face went a deep, blotchy red. "But I designed it," she stammered. "I chose the colors. That is intellectual property." Nadine didn't dignify it with a response. She turned another page. "Now let's examine the sweat equity claim as it pertains to the kitchen renovation." You state that you spent $12,000 on marble countertops. Yes, Lucinda said, seizing on it. We paid for that ourselves, from our joint account. I have the bank statement. I'm sure you do, Nadine said. But let's look at where those funds originated. She lifted the promissory note, the one bearing the red default stamp. 2 weeks before the kitchen renovation commenced, Nadine said, holding the document up. Raymond Whitlow transferred $40,000 into your joint account. The memo line on the transfer reads, Home Improvement Loan. Both signatures on that document bind you to return the principal with 3% interest, payable on demand. She let the page drop onto the table. So, Nadine said, drawing it all together, you spent $12,000 of my client's money putting countertops into my client's house. The other $28,000 went into your pocket lifestyle costs, one presumes, and not a cent came back. That's not a share of equity, Lucinda. That's embezzlement. Grady studied the paperwork. He studied his clients' faces. Something behind his eyes shifted as the full picture assembled itself. He'd walked his people straight into a slaughterhouse. All right, listen, Grady said, dragging his palm across a damp forehead. These figures may look damning, but there's a human side to this. You're putting a family with a small child out on the street. Any judge worth his robe will read that as a grandfather running a vendetta. Unnecessary cruelty, we can make that argument. We can also argue they were given every reason to believe this was a permanent arrangement. I pushed my chair back and set both hands flat on the table. Expectation. That's the precise word, isn't it? I said. You expected it. You treated it as something owed to you. Garrett's eyes came up to meet mine. They were desperate. Dad, stop. Please, we understand. The lesson landed. We're flat broke, all right. We're going under. I'm out of work. We've got nothing left. Give us a few months, just enough time for me to find something. Please, for Owen's sake. Something pulled at me in that moment. This was still my son sitting across the table. The pain on his face was real, but the text message came back to me. We want peace. So did the invoice for the transmission. So did every look they'd shot me at that party, like I existed purely as a source of funds. Nadine moved before I had the chance to open my mouth. A lease extension isn't on today's agenda, she said, voice stripped of any warmth. What's on the agenda is the counterclaim. Counterclaim, Grady said. I'm sorry, what counterclaim? Nadine's mouth curved. It was the kind of smile that belongs to something with a fin on its back. Unjust enrichment, she said. She turned to the rear section of the binder. Out came one final spreadsheet. At the bottom, a single large figure sat inside a red circle. Your clients have argued they weren't guests, that they were tenants with all the protections that implies, Nadine said. Very well. The laws of tenancy cut both ways, and tenants owe rent. She pushed the sheet across to them. A 4-bedroom property on Ridgecrest Drive carries a fair market rental rate of roughly $3,000 per month. And that's the low end. No formal lease exists yet. You're now asserting adverse possession, so we're treating every month you've occupied the home as billable. Garrett's jaw went slack. Are you billing us rent going back 5 years? Nadine gave a single nod. 5 years, 60 months, $3,000 each. That's $180,000. She pressed a fingertip to the figure. Add the $40,000 loan, add accrued interest, add the legal costs of this eviction. She turned her gaze to Grady. Total obligation from your clients to the Whitlow estate, $235,400. Every sound in that room died at once. The number floated above the table like a blade waiting to drop. $235,000. Staggering. For two people who couldn't scrape together enough to throw a birthday party, it might as well have been a prison term. Lucinda's breathing came in short, ragged pulls. Her hand went to her chest. "You can't, that's not possible. We could never cover that. This would wipe us out completely." Nadine shut the binder. "That sound clean, definitive. In that case, I'd recommend considering our settlement offer," she said. Settlement. Grady's voice had gone thin as paper. "What are the terms?" Nadine placed a single sheet in the center of the table. "Mutual release and voluntary surrender," she said. "Read it. First, the property is vacated within 7 days, not the standard 30. 7 days. Second, you leave it clean, broom swept, no damage. Remove a single light bulb and we'll see you in court. Third, you execute a waiver confirming zero claim, financial or otherwise, against the property or the estate." "And on our end," Grady pressed. "On your end," Nadine said, "Raymond Whitlow forgives every dollar. The $180,000 in back rent gone. The $40,000 loan erased. You leave this room with your credit intact. Nothing owed to him and whatever you're wearing." She put her elbows on the table and leaned in. "But the moment that door closes behind you, the offer is dead. One motion to slow the eviction, one filing of any kind, and we go to war. Full pursuit of the entire amount. Wage garnishment. Liens on anything of value you ever acquire. Every paycheck for the next 20 years with your father's name on it first." She looked directly at Garrett. "A clean slate or a lifetime in debt to your own pride, which is it?" Garrett looked at the settlement page. He looked at the spreadsheet and its crushing total. He looked at Lucinda folded over in her chair, crying silently into her palms. The game was over, he could see that now. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a rout. He'd shown up to a nuclear standoff armed with a water pistol. His hand reached for the pen. It was shaking badly enough that gripping the thing was a struggle. "Dad," he said, barely above a whisper. One final look. He wanted me to pull him back from the edge. He wanted me to laugh it off, slide him a check, tell him it was all a test. I held his gaze without moving. "Sign it." "Garrett," I said, "that signature is going to cost you more than any you've ever written, and it's still the bargain of your life." He signed. He surrendered his claim to the house. He surrendered what was left of his dignity. He signed away the fiction he'd been living inside for 5 years. Lucinda went next. No reading, no hesitation, just her name scratched across the line, her tears hitting the paper and blurring the ink underneath. Nadine gathered the document. She verified both signatures, gave a small nod. "Done." 7 days, she said. "Keys on the kitchen counter, noon on Monday. At 12:01, the locks are replaced." Garrett got to his feet. The color had left his face entirely. He looked at me, and I caught something in his expression I hadn't seen before. It was respect raw, and frightened the kind a soldier feels when he watches the general order an airstrike on his own position. "Goodbye, Dad," he said. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't offer good luck. "I'll see you when I see you," I said. The three of them filed out of the conference room. Grady brought up the rear, a man walking like someone quietly rehearsing a career change in his head. The door clicked shut. The silence that filled the room was nothing like the silence before. This one was soft. Nadine let out a long breath. She opened the binder and took out the spreadsheet. She ripped it in half. "You realize we could never have enforced that rent figure in front of a judge, right?" A faint smile crossed her face. No written lease, any decent court would have tossed it out. Pure theater. I rose from my chair and moved to the window. The city spread out below me. The storm had cleared. Gaps were opening in the cloud cover. Across the street, one beam of afternoon light caught the face of a building and lit it gold. "I know," I said, but they didn't. And that gap, that's the whole distance between the people who design the structure and those who simply occupy it. We understand how the load-bearing walls work. I turned around. "Get the photographer back out there, Nadine. The house will be empty come Monday. Have him focus on the kitchen. I hear the marble countertops are expensive." I left the office, rode the elevator to the lobby, and pushed out onto the street. The air had that stripped clean quality that follows a hard rain. I breathed it in. No son on the payroll anymore. No mortgage bleeding out of my account every month. 68 years old and standing for the very first time in a space with no obligations attached to it. I walked to my car. A bookshelf still needed sanding back home, and after that maybe a trip somewhere. Sun Valley had been calling to me, and my calendar was suddenly very open. The end of my son's marriage didn't arrive in a courtroom. It arrived in the driveway on Ridgecrest Drive 48 hours after the ink dried on that settlement. I wasn't present, but a quiet neighborhood keeps no secrets. On a calm street, a screaming match across the front lawn is the best entertainment anyone's seen all year. Mrs. Dunbar from across the way told me afterward she'd witnessed plenty in her time, but never a woman loading a Toomey suitcase with quite that level of fury. Money doesn't manufacture happiness, but strip it away, and people's actual priorities surface fast. For 5 years, Garrett and Lucinda had held together around one shared pursuit: spending mine. Consumption was their common ground. Cut the supply line, and the alliance evaporated on the spot. Turns out their wedding vows had an unspoken footnote for richer or for richer, because poorer was a condition neither had agreed to. The collapse began the second they stepped out of Nadine's office. Court filings came later, and they filled in the details. The drive home was silent until Lucinda snapped and accused Garrett of having deceived her all along. She screamed that she'd married a man who could provide, not a failure who gets terminated by his own father. She threw the word fraud at him. She accused him of burning through the best years of her life. What she didn't grieve was the home they were losing, or what any of it meant for their son. What she grieved was her place in the world. She grieved the Sun Valley trip that would never happen. By Wednesday, moving trucks had pulled up, but not to carry them anywhere together. Lucinda had been on the phone with her parents, who lived modestly 3 states over people she'd essentially written off the moment she'd said her vows to Garrett. Now they were the only door left unlocked. She filled her car with everything worth money. The silverware went in. The artwork went in. The jewelry I'd given her over the years, every anniversary piece went in. Garrett's belongings stayed where they were. Owen's toys stayed where they were. She was packing for one. The driveway scene was the final act. Garrett stood at the trunk of her car, reaching for her, pleading. He had tears running down his face. He kept asking how they were going to come through this side by side. She answered with a laugh, short, cold, surgical, loud enough to carry across the yard. "There is no side by side, Garrett," she said. "You're going under. I'm not grabbing your hand on the way down. You have nothing left, no paycheck, no roof, no inheritance waiting for you. You're a ship that's already taking on water." She climbed into the driver's seat. She didn't spare a glance at the house she'd waged so much to hold on to. She didn't look at the man she'd vowed to stand beside. She dropped it into reverse, backed straight out, and left 2 dark marks on the concrete. She had a divorce filing on record by the following morning. She listed irreconcilable differences, but the true explanation was arithmetic. 0 split 2 ways is still 0. She went after custody of Owen, not out of any impulse to be a full-time mother, but because child support was the one income stream Garrett might still be required to produce. She hadn't yet worked out that 40% of an unemployment check doesn't go very far. Garrett was left standing alone in the driveway of a house already hollowed out. The quiet that descended after her taillights disappeared must have been suffocating. For the first time in his adult life, there was no external target for the blame, no one to redirect the anger toward, just him and the unvarnished truth of what he'd built or failed to. Over the next 2 days, he moved what remained of his things into a storage unit. There wasn't much to move. Strip away Lucinda's decorating and my furniture, and his entire life fit in the back of a rental car. Monday noon came as precise as Nadine had laid out in the terms. He left the keys on the kitchen counter of the house on Ridgecrest Drive, pulled the door shut, turned the lock, and drove away. Not to a new apartment. No landlord would have him. No job, no savings, a credit score. In free fall, he was untouchable on the rental market. He took a room at the Sunset Motor Inn at the edge of town. The kind of establishment that bills by the week, where the towels have been washed enough times to see through. The sign out front promoted color TV and complimentary ice like they were selling points worth bragging about. One evening, I drove that route just to look. His car was sitting in front of room 114, a dented, mid-sized sedan stuffed with fast food wrappers, a far cry from the luxury SUV that used to sit in my driveway. Garrett lay in that room for days, without moving toward anything. Flat on a lumpy mattress, eyes fixed on water stains overhead, listening to the interstate traffic roll past. He was going through the withdrawal that comes when a life of insulation from consequences is suddenly yanked away. 32 years of being caught before he hit the ground. Now the ground was his address. He sent out a few job applications, but his heart wasn't in it. He was still listening for the cavalry. Every hour he unlocked his phone, expecting a message from me, the one where I tell him the lesson is concluded, he's done his time, and I've secured him a decent place downtown. The message never came. Then the final humiliation landed. A Tuesday night, 2 weeks past the eviction, Garrett had fallen behind on his car payments, the one thing he could point to as actually as though he'd needed my co-signature on the loan to get it approved. When I removed myself as guarantor after cutting him off, the bank moved quickly. He was asleep when the tow truck showed up. The orange lights strobed through the curtains of room 114. He burst outside in his boxer shorts, yelling. He tried to physically intervene. He told the driver who he was: Garrett Whitlow, a vice president, a man who mattered. The driver had heard it all before. He attached the hook, raised the car off the pavement, and left. Garrett stood in the motel parking lot in bare feet on grimy asphalt, watching his last tether to the life he'd known get hauled down the road. He looked diminished. He looked like something had broken inside him. The other guests watched through their windows, cigarettes in hand, expressions completely flat. For them, it was an ordinary Tuesday night. He went back inside. He sat on the bed's edge and faced his reflection in the dresser mirror, the one with the crack running across the corner. The rainmaker he used to see there was gone. The grill master was gone too. What looked back at him was a man with pocket change and a box of cold pizza. That night, he reached the floor. There is a particular sound a man produces when he finally breaks all the way through. Not a shout. A sob that originates somewhere deeper, the sound of total, unconditional surrender. Garrett wept. He wept for a woman who had never truly loved him. He wept for the house. He wept for the father he'd treated like an ATM with a pulse. Then he picked up his phone and dialed my number. I was awake. I watched his name light up the screen. I let it ring out. That was not cruelty. It was the hardest thing I have put myself through. Everything in me wanted to answer. I wanted to drive to that motel, settle the bill, hand him a set of keys to a new car. I wanted to make the pain stop. But I understood that rescuing him in that moment would make every bit of suffering he'd endured pointless. If I pulled him out now, he would never learn to pull himself out. He needed that darkness. He needed to discover he could survive it on his own. The ringing stopped. He didn't try again. What he did instead, I didn't see coming. Next morning, Garrett put on the last clean suit he had left to his name. He walked out of the motel. He covered 3 miles on foot to the nearest bus stop. He didn't head to a construction firm. He didn't aim for a corporate tower. He walked into a Home Depot. I heard about it later through someone I know who manages there. Garrett went directly to the store manager. No resume on heavy stock paper. No request for a position that matched his old title. He looked the man square in the face and said, "I need work. I'll move lumber. I'll mix paint. I'll sweep the floor. I just need to work." The manager glanced at the suit, then at the eyes behind it raw and without pretense, and passed him an application. Garrett found an overturned bucket in the lumber aisle, sat down and filled it out. When the form asked for an emergency contact, his pen stopped. He held it there a moment, hovering over the blank line. Then he left it empty. He was beginning to grasp something essential. He was on his own, and for perhaps the first time that was precisely the condition he needed. The fall had taken everything: wife, house, car, whatever remained of his self-image. But standing there, breathing in sawdust and cut wood, he was on the edge of gaining something he'd never once possessed: his own spine. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks out from the eviction, when my son came back to the house he'd once counted on inheriting. The hydrangeas had come into full bloom, those heavy clusters of blue blazing against the foliage, entirely indifferent to the wreckage of human choices that had played out around them. I was on the porch, working the sandpaper across the last corner of Owen's bookshelf. It was done now. Solid, balanced, built to carry weight. I spotted him coming up the driveway. No car. He'd walked from the bus stop a mile back. He was thinner than I remembered. The suit was gone, jeans I hadn't seen in 10 years, and a faded polo shirt had taken its place. There was a slight hitch in his step, a blister maybe, or the particular way shame settles into the body when you carry it far enough. He didn't carry himself like a vice president of business development. He looked like a man who'd lost a prolonged fight. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He didn't come up. He understood that wasn't available to him anymore. "Hi, Dad," he said. His voice had a roughness to it. "Hello, Garrett," I replied. I set the sandpaper down. I didn't ask him to sit. He looked at his shoes, cheap sneakers scuffed along the toe. I just wanted to come by. He started losing his grip on the words. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry." Not about the car, not about the money. About how I treated you. I was arrogant. I was an idiot. You were right about all of it. I studied him. I went looking for the angle, the performance behind the words. But what I found this time wasn't what I'd been expecting. I found a worn-out man. I found genuine fear. "I accept your apology," I said, keeping my voice low. A small light came on behind his eyes. He moved a step closer. "Thanks, Dad. That really means something. Honestly, it's been brutal. Lucinda is gone. The lawyers are bleeding me out. I'm living in a motel that smells like bleach and broken dreams. I'm trying, Dad. I really am, but I just need a hand getting back on solid ground. A small push." And there it was. The pivot. The apology had been genuine, I believed that, but it was also a lever, and he was pressing it against the lock on my wallet. Just a deposit on a place, he said the words coming fast. $2,000 first and last month's rent. You can't hold down a job without a permanent address. Loan me that much and I'll sign whatever you want. A promissory note, any terms you name. I'll pay every cent back. I looked at my son. I loved him. God, I loved him. Every fiber in me was pulling toward the house, the checkbook, the fastest route to making his face change. $2,000 meant nothing to me financially. It was a quiet afternoon's worth of portfolio interest. But the bookshelf came back to me. Cheap wood in the foundation means the whole thing fails once the weight is on it. For 30 years, I had been the cheap wood. That had to stop now. I reached into my shirt pocket and produced an envelope. Garrett's gaze snapped to it immediately. He read it as a check. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping with relief, the tension leaving his whole frame. "I knew you wouldn't let me go under, Dad," he murmured. "Thank you." I came down the steps. I crossed to him. I held the envelope out. He took it with unsteady hands, pulled it open, hungry for what he thought was inside. He drew out this paper. No check. It was a single printed page, a job application for a heavy equipment crew at a commercial dockyard in Astoria. Clipped to it was the business card of a foreman named Briggs. Garrett turned the page over, searching. He looked back into the envelope. Nothing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice unraveling. "That is a job," I said. "I called Briggs this morning. He owes me one from a project we worked together back in '99. He needs general laborers. This is hard work, Garrett, hauling steel cables in the rain alarm going off at 4 in the morning, your back screaming by noon, your hands torn up by the end of the week. It pays $18 an hour." $18. He looked at me as if I'd handed him something obscene. "Dad, I was pulling 6 figures. I can't build a life on $18 an hour." "You can," I said. "Millions of people do it every day. You'll take a room, not an apartment. You'll ride the bus. You'll learn to cook for yourself, and you'll put away every dollar you can spare." "I asked for a loan," he said, his voice splintering. "I asked you for help." "This is help," I said. "Handing you money isn't help, Garrett. It's morphine. Takes the edge off the pain, but does nothing about what's causing it. What's causing it is the belief that you're too good to get your hands dirty, that a comfortable outcome is something you're owed, rather than something you earn." I moved closer to him. "If I put that money in your hand right now, you'll be standing on this porch again, inside of a month, asking for more. Nothing changes. But if you take this job, if you walk through those gates every morning, if you find out what it actually feels like to be tired from labor instead of tired from anxiety, there's a chance you become the man I've always believed you could be." He crushed the paper in his fist. Tears were running freely. "You're cruel," he choked out. "You're getting something out of this." "I'm not getting anything out of this," I said, and my voice wasn't steady either. "This is the hardest thing I have ever done. I'm watching my son bleed out in front of me, and I'm refusing to apply the bandage because I know this wound has to breathe before it can close." I pointed to the crumpled page in his hand. "Briggs is expecting you tomorrow at 5:00 a.m. 1 minute past that, and the opportunity is gone. It's your call, son. Throw that in the trash and walk away, or get on the bus and go to work." I turned around and climbed back up the steps. My legs felt like they were made of something dense and reluctant. I half expected shouting. I half expected the paper to come flying back at me. Neither happened. I picked up the sandpaper. I kept my eyes forward. For a long time I could hear him there, the rough, uneven sound of his breathing, the breeze moving through the hydrangeas. Then came footsteps, receding. I held still until they were gone. Then I set down the sandpaper and lowered myself into the rocking chair. I closed my eyes. A few hours later, my phone lit up. A message from Nadine. "He called Briggs," it said. "He starts tomorrow." I breathed out slowly and watched the sky go purple and gold at the horizon. He'd picked up the fishing rod. I opened my phone's photo gallery. There was Owen grinning wide, a front tooth missing. I pulled up the 529 education plan and authorized the monthly deposit. Then I rang the florist and arranged for a bouquet to go to Lucinda's parents' house card, inside just 4 words for Owen. I wasn't a villain. I wasn't a hero either. I was a father who had finally worked out the difference between love and enabling. People imagine love as something warm and yielding. They think it means saying yes. They think it means wrapping someone up so the cold can't get in. But sometimes love is a wall. Sometimes love is standing in the doorway and saying no so the person you love is forced to locate their own way through. It had cost me my relationship with my son, for now at least. It had cost me the comfortable story of a happy family. But sitting there in the evening quiet, I understood what I'd purchased. I'd bought him his own dignity, and I'd bought myself peace. Tomorrow I'd go to the post office. I'd ship the bookshelf to Owen. Then I'd point the car toward the coast. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. That means more than I can say. Looking back on everything, Raymond went through the torn check, the legal filings, the silence on the porch, while his son walked away. None of it was easy. It cost him the comfortable fiction of a close family. It cost him years of quiet grief. But I believe God doesn't ask us to enable the people we love. He asks us to love them truthfully. And sometimes the truest, hardest love is the one that refuses to cushion a fall that needs to happen. These father stories don't get told enough, the ones where doing right by your child means watching them hurt first. That's where the real work of family justice lives. Here's what I take from Raymond's story. If someone treats your generosity as an entitlement, the kindest thing you can do is stop. Let reality be the teacher you no longer need to be. Document everything, not out of suspicion, but because clarity protects everyone, including the people you love. A fresh start handed to someone is borrowed confidence. A fresh start earned is the kind that holds. Know the difference between helping someone up and holding them down by never letting them fall. If this story moved you, I'd be glad to hear your thoughts in the comments. Share what stayed with you. And if you know someone who's wrestling with a hard call about family, pass this along. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. Subscribe to Alpha Dad Stories if you haven't already. There's more where this came from. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.